Welcome, everybody. I just pointed out that this is going to be quite an information-dense session. I apologize for that. I've had to kind of crunch down what I wanted to present. I think there's probably a full book's worth. I've started trying to work on one. And my slides are also going to be quite text dense, which I found is helpful for many people because of my accent and because, I'm one of those unfortunate people who only really speaks English. So having text dense slides also assists people when they need to translate. What do you need to know about me? I think probably the most important things for this session are where I come from, my ancestry. Right? As far as I know, the first person from my line to arrive in South Africa, aside from, a couple of 100,000 years ago, I think all of us started here. But in the last few hundreds of years, that person, among other things, was a teacher. My father was a primary school teacher who then became a high school teacher, who then qualified as a psychologist in the field of education and then headed the counseling and careers unit at a university for 15 years. And that perspective is exactly why he was one of the co-founders of Riverstone Village, which I'm not going to go into detail now, but I'll mention and show you something from it later. And my mother, when I was born, was a librarian, and I have a great love of reading. And she then requalified as an anthropologist and became a university lecturer. And her perspective, and both of my parents were very interactive people. So I had this parallel education from both of them, sharing with me all of their insights and their perspectives and many deep conversations over the years. So that's really informing what I've come to understand that I would like to share today, because I think it's time. And the second thing I'd like to say before I hit my really text intensive slides is that there's often a feeling of blame in people in mainstream education when we bring up issues around the problems or what needs to be changed or the ways that harm is being done. And when I was a child in South Africa, it was still normal for there to be leaded paint and asbestos as standard building materials in schools. And it wasn't anybody's fault. It wasn't the teacher's fault. It wasn't the principal's fault. It wasn't the parents' fault. Nobody knew how much harm it was doing to children to have this old, ancient, flaking leaded paint and this crumbling asbestos. And even once people started understanding the harm, there was still a real problem logistically. How do you replace these buildings that are already there and doing what they are doing? So it's really only in the last couple of years in South Africa that they've really managed to get a handle on getting the asbestos out, for example. So I want to underline that too, because some of the things I'm going to say tonight can sound extremely harsh, and it's not any of our fault. This is history that we've inherited that isn't necessarily a matter of malevolence. But now that we know what we know and we're coming to understand what we're coming to understand, we really need to pull together and clean things up. So with no further ado, I am going to launch in to this session, which I've entitled Z Cubed, Why Peace in Schools is Hard to Achieve and What We Can Do About It, because I thought it would just be too controversial to call it what I really think it should be called: Why Education in Schools is Hard to Achieve and What We Can Do About It. So firstly, what do we mean by education? I like this definition from UNESCO: processes by which societies deliberately transmit their acculturated information, knowledge, understanding, skills, attitudes, values, competencies, and behaviors across generations. It involves communication designed to bring about learning. On the other hand, if we look at how we transmit our cultures across generations, there's a bigger word, a more of an umbrella word called enculturation, which is all of the processes by which I learn my culture. and it shapes who I am. And I then become a member of that culture as a result of my enculturation experiences. So education is one part of that, but there's another part of that called socialization. And that is where we learn specific values and how to function as members of a social group, to come to understand the norms and roles and expectations. And that doesn't happen through deliberate transmission like education. That actually just happens by immersion, because we are there, because we are living it, because we see what our parents are doing, what our peers are doing, what everybody's doing, and we participate. So education and socialization are two aspects or two ways that enculturation happens. Education is the deliberate, explicit part of enculturation, and socialization is that immersive, implicit way that enculturation happens. So now I'd like to go into a couple of examples. So if we look at grinding corn, we could learn to grind corn like this, and that would be a different culture to a culture that grinds corn like this. And those would both be different cultures to a culture that grinds corn like this. However, for socialization purposes, I'd like to point out that these two have something quite important in common, that this one is sort of a discontinuity with those two. Because for these two on the left, you've got women and children gathering together. It's a communal activity, and the work is slow and rhythmic, and it's got lots of people doing it, and it's bonding community, it's building identity, and it's placing sustenance in a connection, in a lived experience, in cycles of life, and we eat what we grind. So from an educational perspective, we're learning how to grind corn so it's nice and fine, and all the specific skills and knowledge we need for that. But from a socialization perspective, we've got a lovely word in South Africa that's gotten a little far around the world, sometimes interpreted correctly, called Ubuntu, which is I am because we are. It's I am part of the village and the people. And that's part of my identity. We're learning that with these corn grinding practices. We're also learning patience. We're also learning ultimately care for the earth. However, once we go past this commonality and we start getting to the technologies on the right, we've got a very different thing happening. We've now got a small team learning how to build and maintain and operate this mill, and the connection to community and ritual is vastly reduced. And the focus is shifting away from relational care, and it's becoming about sustaining production and managing resources and organization and control. And grinding corn is now an economic activity because we sell what we grind. So in a sense, the education is the same, although it's going to have different content. We're learning how to grind corn so it's nice and fine. But the socialization is totally different. We're learning that power and commerce are normal. We've got values like discipline, punctuality, obedience, working within a structured system. They couldn't be more different. So socialization and education are both ways that we become enculturated, but they work differently. Socialization happens through normal everyday life, joining in and belonging. So we can see this mom and baby, this is something we share for pleasure. It's something that happens in our household. This is something we do together. What do we do? How do we do it? Whereas education is more intentional, it's planned. But socialization is very powerful because it's your primary lived experience, and that can work with or against education. So we know by now, for example, that in households where reading is a common everyday experience, those children are going to find it much easier to learn to read when they get into a formal environment. Whereas children who are encountering text for the first time ever, when they are taught to read, are going to have a much harder time and might not understand the point and the value. So enculturation is strongest when you've got both of these aspects working together rather than working against each other. And that's going to bring us to another concept, which is acculturation. So this was enculturation. Now, acculturation is about changing my enculturation through having contact with a different culture. So this is, again, a particular form of socialization when we experience a different culture. Like if we move to a new country where they have a different language, we can learn that language, we can learn their customs. We might also share some of our traditions with the people we find there. And even simple exposure can lead to acculturation. So what we're seeing now with the internet is a whole lot of us are getting this information we've never had before. And things my mother used to tell me that like none of my friends knew. They're now like all over TikTok, right? That people do things differently elsewhere. And even that simple exposure can start shifting how we see ourselves and our place in the world. So we are enculturated by our original surroundings, and that's very strong. But we can also adapt and we can also choose what we want to embrace as our own. And education often deliberately supports acculturation. If you look at lots of programs for immigration, they often deliberately will teach immigrants a new language or cultural information that they need in order to acclimatize. Which brings us to the question of human rights. So what is the human rights vision for education? A very condensed quote here. The education to which every child has a right is one designed to promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all peoples. To empower the child by developing their skills, learning, and other capacities, human dignity, self-esteem, and confidence. We're really talking here about peace. Peace that's grounded in how we experience other people, and peace that's grounded in being at peace with ourselves, feeling good about ourselves and friends with ourselves. So this vision is about what culture do we want transmitted through education from a human rights perspective. And what we want, because human rights is also very aware of the need for children to learn about their own enculturation in their own community. We want that local culture preserved and transmitted, but we do want it adapted also, because not all cultures encourage peace, self-esteem, confidence, understanding, and friendship among all peoples. So that's what we're after. We want to encourage peace through empowerment in a way that we can bring that into every culture in the world. So we want to strengthen any existing socialization for tolerance, empowerment, and peace. And where children haven't been socialized for that, then education needs to provide acculturation by bringing in new experiences, new information, so that children can experience toleration, empowerment, and peace for the first time. And sometimes they might have been actively enculturated for prejudice, intolerance, and violence. And then they can get new information through their education. They can become more tolerant and compassionate. I've seen this many times in my own career, where children maybe come from a racist kind of concept at home, or sexist, or ageist, and they can shift. And also children who are enculturated to accept being abused and don't have that self-esteem and self-confidence can also often find healing and empowerment through an educational environment. But education is not enough, because information is not enough. We also need the socialization, because that's the strongest anytime, and especially when it comes to cultural shifts. If we just tell you to do something new, that's often hypocrisy. When we live an experience of something new, that's real. And so that's why children need a lived experience of peace, tolerance, and empowerment in their educational spaces. All pretty obvious. We learn what we live. That's the definition for socialization. And this is also why many human rights advocates are a bit leery of things like homeschooling or very small micro schools, because they want children to get along with a wide range of people, so the children grow up feeling that diversity is normal. And we want children to feel the tolerance for each other and care for each other feels normal. And there's some beautiful quotes in various human rights documents. And quite a lot of them, people might not realize, do point out that the full range of rights is not supposed to be undermined in an educational setting. There's another quote, children don't lose their rights by virtue of walking through the school gates. But these other rights should be reinforced by the values imparted in the educational process, the socialization that goes on. Not only because of the content in the curriculum, which is the education bit, but also the educational processes, pedagogical methods, and environment within which education takes place, because all of that is the socialization that makes the education make sense. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the first of these documents, and that was drafted as a direct result of World War II, because the hope was that something like World War II would never, ever happen again. They wanted world peace, and they were, how are we going to achieve this? So they recognized that education was critically necessary. Maybe they didn't have the word acculturation. It was around, but it was very niche. But they needed acculturation to actually make world peace possible. But they didn't know what we know now. So they couldn't tell exactly what was going to do the job, what kind of education would be needed. Nevertheless, they hotly debated including the wording, elementary education shall be compulsory. We see that now, and we think, oh, it's just there. They hotly debated it. And in the end, they only included it on the understanding that it did not mean compelling children to attend schools against their will. Instead, they voted, and I think, if I remember correctly, it was 6 votes to 7, right, to include the word compulsory, because they had reassured each other that it was intended to mean that no one, neither the state nor the family, could prevent the child from receiving elementary education, and that the idea of coercion was in no way implied. And that's from the meeting minutes. So the compulsory isn't a compulsory on the child, it's a compulsory on the state and the parent, because we've always this thing people raise, oh, but if you don't make it compulsory, the parents will use the kids for child labor. Oh, no. And the state won't bother to provide. This is what it was meant to mean, which is lovely to know, because before then I thought, were these people mad? Eleanor seemed like such a nice woman. Right. However, they then simply continued using the school systems that they had adopted directly before World War II. They still had the lead paint, they still had the asbestos, they didn't know this was a problem, right? They were hoping to adjust the education in there to teach human rights and peace, and they didn't realize how much role the model was going to play, because the model had actually played a role in creating World War II. And they didn't realize that sticking with it was going to mean staying on the warpath, because, hello, I think the development of nuclear warfare has done more for world peace than anything human rights has achieved so far, or education has achieved so far. I think we're just really scared to press the buttons. Otherwise, I think we would have had World War III decades ago. And we're constantly teetering on the brink of it. And we have so much conflict anyway. I don't need to state the obvious. What was this thing that they had already adopted? So this is the thing I've recently come to call C cubed, because I've been having some big ahas in the last few months. So what is C cubed? Well, the first C, the foundation, and maybe the most important one, is competition. So competition is in our genes, because otherwise none of us would be here. Absolutely everything on this planet has to compete to live, right? We compete for survival, and it's kill or die. Whether it's spinach you're killing or a chicken you're killing, you can't eat without destroying something, right? And for most of our evolution, there was also the option of us being somebody's dinner. And we still have that symbolically these days, right? So competition is a very serious thing in our psyche. And the moment that we get into a competitive situation, it really puts us into unsafety. And then it depends what else there is. So this is also where you'll see a lot of people struggling to keep their sense of safety and calm when they get into a position that's very competitive. And the more unsafety there is from the rest of their life, or the more sensitive their brain is to experiencing unsafety, the harder time they're going to have being put in a competitive situation. But we can also have friendly, playful, I'm going to use the old Latin word competere, which is where the word competition comes from, because that meant striving together, right? It didn't mean vanquishing each other. So everything depends on the meta context and the direct signaling between people, whether this is serious or friendly. And you can see this when kids are playing. They can be rough and tumbling, and then you can watch it shift into competition, right? When one of them gets angry and now it actually changes modes from one kind where they were seriously trying to beat each other in a friendly way to the other. And here I want to introduce what I came across last year for the first time, this incredible set of insights from one James Carse, unfortunately deceased. I would have loved to chat to him in person, online. Finite and infinite games. So he said, a finite game is played for the purpose of winning. And in order to win, there has to be an end, and there have to be conditions for us to know who won. Whereas an infinite game is played for the purpose of continuing to play. Very different. Finite games, he says, can be played within an infinite game, but an infinite game cannot be played within a finite game. That's simple logic. Infinite players regard their wins and losses in whatever finite games they play as but moments in continuing play. Now, Peter Gray, I see you're on this call, and I'm delighted with that, because I first came across this concept from you in the idea of the long game and the short game, where you were pointing out that, you know, the kids who are playing the short game will be bad sportsmen, right? They just want to win, and they're going to get furious if they lose. And the result of that is they're going to lose the long game because their friends aren't going to want to play with them next week because it wasn't fun. And that's part of our process of learning is, you know, when we have those opportunities, we get that direct feedback. But if we look at the contrast between these two photographs, you know, war, we want to actually kill and vanquish and have an end to it. Whereas, you know, in martial arts contests, if you kill your opponent, you're out of there. And that's ideally not what you even want to do. You're more doing competere here. You're striving for excellence by being able to engage with a worthy opponent. And your wins and losses in those finite games are moments in your continuing infinite career, right? So, for example, a job interview is a finite game. Your full career is an infinite game. And so competition can be benevolent when the players are in infinite mode rather than playing in finite mode. So we could call the judo competition sparring or competere versus competition. And then, of course, there's what I'm now calling coagonism, which is another thing entirely and is pure infinite. This is a picture from Riverstone Village. This is one of our facilitators who's really, really good at this stuff. Most incredible experience to offer the kids. This little one, I think he's about 6 or 7 at the time, is pushing this adult right over backwards. What a joy. So I would call that coagonism, with the warring stuff being, even if it's chess, antagonism, and, you know, the friendly, serious competition within the infinite game would be agonism. And these are things I'm going to delve into when I finally get this book out. These terms are used in medicine in the perfect way, but I'm not going to digress there. So, what kind of games are war and peace? So again, James Carse says, war is the ultimate finite game. Duh, right? Can't get a more finite game than war, whether it's between two people or two clans or two countries. And then he says something really wow. I don't like the word evil. So he was also a historian of religion. I don't know what else to use, and I think it's important to use his quote as is for the concept. He says, evil does exist. It is when an infinite game is absorbed utterly in a finite game. And all evil is an attempt to eliminate evil. Now, this is something that I had to chew on for days, and I think I'm going to keep chewing on for longer. So he also wrote another book called The Religious Case Against Belief, where, for example, he points out that, religion and spirituality is meant to keep expanding you, and you keep expanding your worldview, and you keep questioning, and you keep learning more. Whereas the moment that you get into a very tight, let's call it, these words are loaded now, I don't know what else word to use, evangelical mode, where you're trying to convert other people to save their souls, and you're going to do this at any cost. You've got these religious jihads like the Crusades, for example. So that's an illustration of what he's there calling evil, when that finite game of winning and converting someone to your religion becomes your religion. Then you've collapsed your whole infinite spiritual process into a finite game, and you're trying to eliminate evil, and oopsie. So with that in mind, what do we mean when we say peace? Because I grew up under apartheid in South Africa, and there was a song that we used as an anthem in the anti-apartheid movement by a popular band of the time, and one of the lines was, supposed to be sort of a parody of what one of our political uh, people in power would have said at the time. As long as peace and order reign, I'll be damned if I can see a reason to explain why the fear, the fire, and the guns remain. So, that's peace, right? So this is another example of peace, is the Berlin Wall, right? Um, but that's not peace, because peace isn't an end we can achieve and hold in place. Trying to force peace as a final outcome means absorbing that infinite game of peacemaking, which is a balance and a dynamic interplay with changing all the time, into this finite game that collapses in this end to peace, with end called peace, right? And that's suppression. It's not peace. So why do we need to center human rights and well-being? Because anywhere that you've got suppression, you won't see human rights and you won't see well-being. And if you're not seeing human rights and you're not seeing well-being, you're not seeing peace. So it's a good diagnostic and also a great remedy. So infinite play is playful. It invites a commitment to dialogue and unpredictability, and continuing to play and adapt the game, keeping it open for inclusion and allowing it to unfold in surprising ways. To now go to what kind of game is education and schooling. So Cars directly commented on this beautifully. He said, training is a finite game. You get a certificate, you got it, you didn't, you passed, you failed, you know how to do it, you don't, you get into the profession, you don't, right? Whereas education, he said, is always an infinite game. When does education end? Right? Never. We've come to this funny phrase called lifelong learning. We could just say education if we hadn't hijacked the term to mean training, right? More beautiful things, he said, to be prepared against surprise is to be trained. You want to know what to do in every situation. You want to know what to predict. You want to know what to do when it happens. Whereas to be prepared for surprise is to be educated. Then you are adaptable. You're resilient. You can be creative. You're expecting things to change, right? And this, the most critical distinction between these two types of games. Obviously, in the finite game, you have to keep the rules the same. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game because that's not fair. You have to have your win conditions clear and you have to stick to them. Otherwise, you don't know who won, and then the game doesn't end properly. Whereas the infinite game, he says, the rules have to be changed during the course of play. They have to. And they're changed any time that the players realize that the game is going to end. The game is being imperiled, endangered by a finite outcome, meaning that somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. Then you realize, whoops, we've got to shift things here because otherwise it's not the real thing anymore. Which brings to mind our concept of inclusive education. When we realize that there are children who are not coping with the system, we've got to change the rules to get them included so they're not losing. Okay. So training, some pass, some fail. Education, everyone grows to fulfill their personal potential, which again is right there at the heart of everything human rights ever wrote about education. Now we come to the question of schooling as we know it in the mainstream. It's got victory of some players and defeat of others. Right there. I mean, we've just had this big gedunte, sorry, in South Africa, that's a big business, a big thing going on around cheating on the final high school exam. And then that was followed by the results because they get announced in January in our country, things end in December. And, you know, who were the top students? Yeah. It's a finite game. It's training. It's not education. And education absorbed into schooling or training is one big finite competition made up of a series of little finite competitions for the whole of childhood. I'm just going to be quiet there for a second to let that sink in, given the quotes in the previous slides about absorbing the infinite game into a finite game. Moment of silence. Okay, so who did this first? Who brought competition into schooling to achieve training for what? This brings us to another culturation. This time it is inculturation. And what is inculturation? So inculturation takes the main ideas of specifically a religion, although I think it also applies to a worldview or a philosophy. And it turns them into ways of doing things that make sense in a new place, keeping the main lessons the same. So you see here a Catholic Mass. It couldn't look more different than what you would see in Rome. You've got little girls dancing in rhythm with their fly whisks. Everybody's going in circles around the altar. I can guarantee you the music was not Latin. Very vibrant version because it's been translated. It's still Catholicism, it's still the Mass, but it's fitting the culture in Zaire. And so the form changes, but the meaning and the values stay the same. The same socialization is happening, like those two grindstones, one which was a grinding bucket, one which was a stone, same socialization, different form. Today we can frame this as mutual respect and dialogue, emphasizing that local culture is valuable in its own right. That's great, that's cool. However, originally, it was just a strategic method to embed a religion's beliefs, values, worldview, and behavioral patterns into as many contexts as possible, right? It was part of the sales pitch. And if we're going to look at Zaire, from 1908, from what I looked up, by the way, if anybody knows a historian who wants to come and help me with this book, I would so treasure that. Anyway, from 1908 in Zaire, Belgium, because it was their colony, subsidized missionary schools to convert locals to Christianity and train them for labor useful to the colonists. And epistemicide, which is the destruction of local knowledge systems and heritage traditions. Epistemicide, right? Like homicide, but episte being knowledge. Basically killing off a system of knowledge is now recognized as a form of severe systemic violence that caused enormous harm. So as beautiful as this Mass may be spiritually, you're looking at something down the line that's healed out from a very severe, violent event. Now, competition first came into the Jesuit colleges, their own colleges, something called the Ratio Studiorum. It was a pedagogical method, and they took it with them into the mission schools, and a lot of other orders also started adopting competition for a number of reasons. And many colonies therefore saw the first emergence of what I call C-squared schooling. As the second C enters the picture. What's the second C? Well, the second C is coercion. It is forcing people to go into school against their will. And when you get forced into going into school and then forced to compete, you've got a different level of competition. Things are getting gladiatorial now. And I discovered so far, until I get my historian friend, the earliest one I've managed to find was in my own country, which really makes this my business to sort out. Legal coercion to attend school began in South Africa for slave children, not free children, not children who were intended to have well-being and growth and become empowered. Quite the opposite. 1682, a colonial decree requires compulsory school attendance from all slave children under 12 years of age. Older slave children have to attend school twice a week. Both settlers and slaves ignore this, and some slaves even hide in mountain caves on one occasion to avoid going to school, which I love. It's like first compulsory schooling, first truancy. It's like, come on. Who are you kidding that you're going to have one without the other? I think the settlers ignored it because they didn't want the time off work, and the slaves obviously didn't find it was valuable, and I'm guessing that's because it was C-squared. And religious instruction was heavily emphasized. And the children were also taught to read and write in Dutch, which obviously wasn't their home language, teaching the qualities of a good slave from the owner's perspective, such as obedience and respect, were not neglected either. Very interesting when you think about our school system and its values today. Obedience and respect, as we say. Right. So colonial schools all around the world basically existed to inculturate Christianity and acculturate indigenous peoples to whatever settler language and culture, so that they could be used for labor for extractive purposes, and also to create a docile populace that was easy to rule, which we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So coercion doesn't just add to competition. It's not C plus C. It takes competition to another level, because when you're forced to compete, whether you want to or not, it can't be a friendly, playful competition, right? And that can break spirits of the losers because they feel worthless and they failed, they didn't win. It can break the spirits of the winners because they get survival guilt, especially if they love their companions. And it can really break community solidarity, which is one of the things that makes a populace easier to rule. So going back to our mill, because this is obviously, the system that was coming in here. These C-squared schools existed in colonies long before Prussia's compulsory system that we always look at as being the ancestor of our mainstream schooling system. And they were not about education. They weren't aiming to educate, right? They trained obedience and enculturated a particular version of Christianity. And I want to underline here that Christianity is a very big umbrella word. And this is not Christianity we are criticizing here. This is a particular version. One truth was taught by all-powerful teachers, demonizing local wisdom. Morally inferior children and colonized people were saved by schooling. Obedience was virtue. Failure was blamed on personal weakness. And alongside socializing this specific take on Christian values, this also helped colonizers control the local people. A small group of obedient graduates were given privileges and co-opted as local enforcers. Most of them, the bulk of them, were trained for labor and taught to believe that suffering was their own fault, not the result of injustice. And when we replace religion with secular subjects, that doesn't change the structural socialization of that design. whatever curriculum. I know when I went to school, that curriculum was still gospel and the teachers were still like priests. Obedience was still morally good and questioning the system was bad. Children still arrive in something that's like original sin. They're not good enough and they've got to strive for academic salvation. And those who graduate, especially with A's, they'll get the heavenly reward of the world opening up to them, and they'll blame their own laziness for a life in adult hell if they drop out or fail. The story is still the same. It's a niche Christian worldview that's enculturated as reality, and all of us pretty much now have grown up with that, and it looks like normal. So C squared is a finite game that absorbs education into a finite game. It absorbs that infinite game of education into a finite game. And it can never be secular in its essence while it's got these elements, right? Now we come to our third C, which is really where things clicked into place for me. What did the third C add? So the third C comes along in Prussia, yes, when we know it does, but it's not about factories, because I always hear, Prussia, factory schooling. But 1763, historian check me please, but what I found is that looks like when Industrial Revolution is really kicking in England. It's 100 years later in Prussia that it really gets going. At the point that they start C cubed in Prussia, they add this third C, which is cohorting. Now, cohorting, when I looked for the first cohorting, you find it way back in cultures like Sparta. But then it's like three groups of like the young males, the middle males, and the older males, because it's for military purposes. There's not much difference between an 8-year-old learning to read and a 16-year-old learning to read. There's a huge difference between an 8-year-old learning to use a sword and a 16-year-old using a sword. So military worlds really need cohorting for their education. And in Prussia, soldiers were already organized by age, by intake year, by rank, and by drill unit, and they took that design and now they put it onto school at home. They brought the same C squared that they were already using worldwide now in the colonies, and they brought this in, and they brought it into line with the military in order to feed the military. Because now you've got these kids coming up in these nice, neat ranks, and then they can go into their military training. So you've got this age segregation by year now. You've got this fixed curriculum because you have to have standardization if you're going to compete, because you can't compete if you're not doing the same thing. You've got your classes, which are like your drill units. And now you've enabled the possibility of having inspections like you do in the military, except now these are assessments, these are tests. How well has the child, instead of how well can they salute and stand up straight and shoot their gun at the target, how well can they pass the test? And this made a very efficient sorting system and pipeline to feed that army and the bureaucracy that supported it. Let's notice, still the same aim as colonial missionary schools. They were still heavily inculcating Christianity, and they were still converting humans into human resources. And that competition between age mates with the cohorting, again, cubes rather than adds, because, again, 8 versus 16, who's going to win? Duh. Whereas the moment that you bring all the kids onto one age level, then that competition really feels very serious. Because everybody accepts it as legitimate, which has got quite a horrible result, which I'll go into in a few minutes. But first, let's carry on looking at the Germanic territories, because who used this system to wow effect, right? Hitler could not have pulled off what he did without C cubed. And we know this, the Hitler youth was, we say, brainwashed. They were just schooled by C cubed very efficiently. So instead of, there was still kind of a religious thing, but it actually became Nazi ideology with Hitler kind of becoming more and more deified, but it was still very much enculturation. And then from what I've been looking at, when I thought, now, but let me have a look at the others who were the main ones in World War II, and when did they start with C cubed? And all the names start popping up, like the UK and the USA and Japan. It's like, okay, they've all recently got C cubed before World War II. So all of these major players seem to have C cubed in time for their war machines. And I solidly believe that C cubed actively made World War II both logistically and ideologically viable. Ideologically, because you've got at least one generation, and in some countries, many generations, who are used to this finite game idea and this obedience thing, and it's all cool, it's all normal. They'll do and die. And the drafting committee of the UDHR, again, argued about this word compulsory when the war was over because, and you see it in the minutes there, they're worrying. It's like, look what Hitler did with this, right? And they saw that compulsion undermines the fabric of safety and dignity. And safety and dignity for all are the two things upon which human rights is founded. And there was literally argument about the fact that you cannot logically force someone to fulfill a right. Otherwise, it isn't a right. I can't force you to eat. And that's this is where, it's a war crime, not a war crime, it's a human rights atrocity to force a hunger striker to eat. It's against their human rights. Okay, you can't force somebody to fulfill their right to education. And they sensed that treating human beings of all ages as fully human is the only way to sustain peace. It's the whole point of human rights. And that means education must be directed towards empowerment and thriving, not conversion of humans into resources. But they didn't realize that competition and cohorting were just as dangerous as coercion, and that all three could compound to have unintended impacts. How were they supposed to guess? Okay, let's go into a couple of impacts. Like what? What terrible things does C cubed do? Okay, so let's just start with alternative facts, our recent pandemic in the world. This doesn't actually come back to the French Revolution. Well, maybe it does, but it does for me personally because it was my experience in school. So I was a very self-directed learner in history. At one point, I loved it. Starting to rediscover as I'm starting to feel like it's this treasure hunt back through time. But I'm still a bit traumatized by history, which is why I want a historian to help me. Somebody who loves it and doesn't have the stuff. So history at school for me was deadly dull compared to what I was reading in my own time. And I had just been delving into the French Revolution, and I loved this so much. And then I heard that French Revolution was coming up next term, and I spent my whole holiday going, yay, at last, school history will be fun, even if it's just for 2 weeks. And I got into my first class, and the teacher was going on about Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. And I was like, pah, I've got a little treasure to share with you. She didn't. That was propaganda. And the teacher was like, well, if you want to pass the test, you'll have to say that Marie Antoinette said, let them eat cake, because otherwise you'll lose the mark. And my whole world went boom, as on some level I realized where I was and what was going on. So our children are less cognitively capable than we were at their age, says Dr. Jared Horvath, neuroscientist. He has his own theories on it. I think this is a lot to do with it. Studies indicate that children, teenagers, students, and also adults are increasingly unable to distinguish between news and fake news, between a scientific study and a sponsored advertisement. This is a quote from a wonderful professor that almost managed to keep me in my education, Masters of Education philosophy degree. When schools reward fluency over understanding and alignment over critical inquiry, then who learns critical thinking skills in the first place? And who grows up structurally incentivized to care about truth? To continue from Kai, even those who applaud the speakers know more often than not that what they have just been offered is untrue, but they do not care because they like what they have heard. So we've learned to pick our truths according to what's going to get us the reward. not according to whether or not it is true. So alternative facts, well, their day has come. In the post-truth era, borders blur between truth and lies, honesty and dishonesty, fiction and non-fiction. Deceiving others becomes a challenge, a game, and ultimately a habit. And yeah, let's notice the game. So now let's go a little into core needs in education and schooling. This is another one of the impacts of C cubed. Human rights, as I said, is founded on the universal need for dignity, and self-determination theory, another one of my favorite topics, has identified 3 further human needs universally core to well-being. They've checked this cross-culturally with all sorts of people, that when you have these needs filled, you tend to thrive. Even if you think you don't need these needs, the people who don't really have them tend not to thrive. They are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy is undermined by being coerced, microcontrolled, and forced into a standardized system regardless of diversity and your individuality. Competence is undermined by being forced to tackle learning to which we are not personally suited, which makes us feel stupid, and by coerced assignments supported by cohorting, coerced assessments on your assignments supported by cohorting, especially when the focus is on our weaknesses and not our strengths. That's really going to undermine our sense of competence. When we're constantly compared with our peers, that's going to cause an issue. The majority of us are not going to win or rank high at the end of school game, and that's the design. In some countries like Britain, there's a whole third that's going to fail and another third that's going to feel like, right? And in many places, it's only sort of the top 3 in the class that really get to feel maybe good if they don't have the survivor guilt or the trauma from what it took to get there. But the relatedness with your peers is going to be under strain. And the relatedness with your teachers is going to be under strain because, relatedness, infinite games exist to build relatedness. It's what they're all about. Whereas the moment we're in a finite game, that survival fear kicks in and relatedness is automatically going to start being at risk. And when we've got coerced competition, then it's very hard to meet the need for relatedness. So we could say, and I do believe, that C cubed systematically undermines all core needs. It's actually a coordinated attack on well-being. And I did choose to say that because when I think about it, well-being was deliberately undermined in colonial schools. This is where we come back to that thing of helping make a docile populace. If you undermine people's well-being, you disempower them, you make them controllable, you make them exploitable, right? So this is also where I said it's not anybody's fault. It doesn't mean the teachers are doing the attacking. It doesn't even mean the policymakers are doing the attacking. Like the lead paint and that asbestos attacks the body, the way that this whole thing has been designed is attacking well-being. And there's quite a bit of evidence mounting up that social media and smartphones might not be the main cause of mental health problems with our youth. Hot topic in self-directed education circles. Again, that cohorting version of coerced competition then makes competition feel as real as possible because it becomes a true finite game with very clear win and lose conditions. And then we bring in the stakes because you're told that your marks are a reflection of your actual worthiness to survive. It's like, well, you don't deserve a good job. You're deserving to thrive. I remember, I think in grade 1 or grade 2 maximum when a teacher told one of my classmates that he was going to be a street sweeper and it would be his own fault. So the stakes of this game are very high and can feel extremely stressful. And that level of pressure sustained can result in fight, flight, freeze, and fawn states. Fawn being another one of these states that a lot of people aren't aware of, but it means you become obedient. right, as a way to survive. It's not healthy. And I think that mainstream schooling thinks it's ideal. Um, and trauma, it's actually a form of trauma. And quite a few of us who did very well at school were very good girls. Had to actually deal with trauma later. I had post-traumatic stress syndrome for my first year of varsity. I used to wake up sweating, having dreamed that university was a holiday and I had to go back to school. Um, so yeah, coerced, cohorted competition held in place with obedience training supports fawning as that ideal outcome. It also channels fight into being deployable because you get all this rage and resistance and you can't hit back. So, now I'm going to point you in this direction. It's like, go kill these people in the other country. Boom. Yeah, that feels good. And or into punching down because you'll get your stress out on somebody below you. And then we wonder why we have so much bullying and domestic violence, etc. It also pushes the envelope on the people who are going to go into flight or freeze so that they really don't cope and they drop out or they can be excluded or they just fail. And then, of course, those fighters who do try and punch up can be expelled for being rebellious. So that really works quite well in terms of keeping the peace and order suppression version. And well-being and long-term outcomes in these systems, of course, you still get kids getting through these systems and they're A-OK. You do. That doesn't mean that none of this was operating. It depends also what socialization is available at home and in the community. How much resilience have you got? So I noticed, even when I was at school, I noticed that the kids who were doing the best, emotionally speaking, were the kids whose parents said, I don't care what marks you get, as long as you're happy, whatever, don't do your homework, it's cool, none of it matters, right? Some of them were high achievers, some of them were not. Some of them left as soon as they were allowed to leave. But other factors, how competent do you feel maybe in your extramurals? I think there's all sorts of factors that can feed your resilience. But to the extent that you don't have that, this system can really have a very high personal, individual impact. And this is also why most extreme colonial schools were or are often residential. So there was no escape. It was wall to wall. And I do want to point out that this is still happening. For example, in mountain villages in India, where those villages are sitting, for example, on minerals that people want access to, we still do have police escorting children to schools that are funded by benevolent people who want to do the best for third world education with their donations. So please be very careful what you support. How does all of this affect microculture within schools? Well, hurting people hurt people. We know this. And instead of scapegoating the child or adult who's being harmed enough to become harmful, and instead of performative, nice campaigns, tick, 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 stop bullying, we could just tackle the root causes. From UNESCO's Happy Schools guidance, imagine a school where everyone feels safe, valued, and inspired to learn. These are our best schools, fantastic schools where people feel safe, valued, inspired to learn. They're rare. Thank heaven they're becoming more common. But in what world is that because they really amped up the coerced competition and age-based disempowerment, right? None of that creates safety or feeling valuable or feeling inspired to learn. Self-determination theory also shows us that when motivation is controlled by the outside reward and punishment, it can backfire. Every force has an equal and opposite reaction. On my mind today, the young mother who told me the reason she smokes, in spite of the harm to her children and herself, is that she craves a way to not feel like she's the good girl all the time. Once we understand human motivation, it's easy to see how we reach this place where for huge proportions of the population, being good and healthy feels claustrophobic. And breaking the rules and being destructive feels fun and free. And solid facts are out of fashion and bullshit and unfounded opinion is in. When being good and being right or correct are thoroughly colonized by controlled motivation as happens in school, to the point that there's hardly any space to be autonomously motivated to be good or right, then being bad and wrong becomes synonymous with autonomy. And the only way to feel autonomous is to rebel. And that's from just a daily thought that I had back in 2019 after an experience with that mom. So coercion in schooling today isn't just about forced attendance. It's within the school environment in nearly every dimension. You can't eat or move or pee or anything without permission at the right time. This coercion is cognitive, it's emotional, it's on your social connection. Everything's externally regulated at a very micro level in most people's school experience. Does any of this encourage creativity, innovation, initiative, and responsibility? Competition, again, not a single mechanism, but it's a layered system. They're competing against each other for everything. Their grades, time, approval, identity, status, future access. Does this encourage collaboration, compassion, fairness, ethical behavior? Cohorting, it simultaneously organizes a whole lot of things: time, comparison, identity, futures. Does any of this support equity, diversity, encourage initiative or critical thinking? So it's not easy to play this finite game in infinite mode unless you have strong supportive factors at home or in the community. It can be done, and I've watched it being done a couple of times, very interestingly, by kids who started off in self-directed spaces and then decided they wanted to go to school, mainstream school, for whatever reason, because they already had such a grip on their own education as an infinite game that then they chose to go into the finite game of school from an empowered place, knowing they could leave again, right? And then it's a completely different ball game, okay? But schooling, mainstream schooling, default trains us to put that infinite game, put all infinite games aside and focus on short-term standardized ways to win finite games. And very little of this is necessary for administrative purposes. I've been digging into this a little bit because, it's like, but fair enough, you've got to keep everything running. But it's like, no, actually, when you really dig into it, this isn't the stuff you need for safeguarding and registers and being able to keep track of whether children are okay. This is not what you need. Its function is ideological, and by now it's habitual. We've inherited it, and it's the air we breathe. It's the fish, it's the fish swimming in the water, right? So this session is one of many that's kind of going on, that's going, hang on a sec, let's notice, let's dig in. So I really do increasingly feel, when I look at the state of the world, of course, there's no one cause. There's a lot of different causes, a lot of different things coming together. But the anchoring, climate change, geopolitical conflicts, economic instability, food and energy shortages, democratic erosion, the anchoring, right? It's got complex causes, but it's been anchored by this training, generation after generation. Prioritize the finite game, not the infinite game. Prioritize the quick win, not the more complicated, long-term, harder thing that's harder to define. It's like people in poverty circumstances are famous for wasting their money on things like Coca-Cola, because it feels good right now and it's going to help me. And, I've got no infinite option. So like feel good now is all I've got, right? And this is, yeah, what we've got here. But, what if we're not educated? Even those of us with university degrees, what if we're not really well prepared for surprise? I mean, I think our situation in the world is telling us. I mean, all adults are panicking around taking away the smartphones and the social media. We don't know what to do, except, we're using outdated training to meet new challenges. We're not adaptable. not resilient. We haven't become educated. Instead of being empowered to embrace uncertainty and play with it creatively and collaboratively and with confidence and change the rules as fast as we need, we've been trained to expect control, and control is what we're using, because we're collectively frightened now, more and more every day. We're getting more and more terrified, and we don't know what to do with it. So we do this seeking safety and authoritarianism, the return of fascism, intensified competition in all sorts of ways. I think there's a reason why the new generation is obsessively watching things like Squid Game. It makes perfect sense psychologically. That we're watching this finite games of denial and blame and scapegoating individuals and groups and searching for someone to give us instructions, because that's what we've been trained to do. We've all got lead poisoning. We've all been breathing asbestos. So what do? How can we achieve a culture of peace and actual education in school environments? Because this is not a doom talk. This is a hope talk, right? Or an intention talk, right? So number one, easy to say, progressively reduce until we completely remove all 3 C's. And whatever degree you start with is going to be good. Derry last night had this most fantastic talk, and one of the many, many things he mentioned, and please get hold of the recording of that talk and share it everywhere you can, is what came to be known as the Hannam report, where you looked at the impact of citizenship education being taken seriously in schools. And that's still with C cubed there, but simply increasing the agency of the children and their involvement in that kind of way already even improved their conventional scores in their C cubed assessments, as well as their personal well-being. Anywhere you're going to erode one of these C's is already going to help. So what can we do about compulsion? We can replace it with child-led, rights-based quality assurance, right? Child-led, rights-based quality assurance. We can come and we can say, how much is their children's rights fulfillment in this spot, and how much is the child the one who's doing the feedback around how the quality is? Because educational environments and offerings that really meet children's needs attract children who then don't need to be forced to engage. So we often have this story like happened to Riverstone Village. It's like the first holiday we had after opening, the kids wanted to vote it out that they didn't have to go on holiday. And the staff simply said, well, I'm sorry, but none of us will be here, and you can't open up without the key. We had to strong arm it. Yeah, respecting children's rights and agency builds motivation and well-being and capacity to engage. That's what we can do. Instead of compulsion, obviously, it's going to be a progressive realization that we can move towards. Competition can be replaced with capacity building. There's no point in assessing for anything other than support. We want children's assessments to be volitional. We want them to want the feedback, and we want to give it to them when they're ready for it and they're asking for it for their own purposes. And then we want to give it in a way that's going to help them identify their personal next best steps. There's no point in comparing them to their friends. What single point is there for education rather than training in comparing this child to that child? If we're all going to be reaching our full potential, my progress has nothing to do with your progress. If we want to know how well the teachers are doing their job, well, that's in the point above. Find out from the kids, let them vote with their feet, find out which teachers are actually meeting their needs. Kids will spar, they will compete against each other, but to keep it to be sparring and positive, it needs to be voluntary. Let them enter Olympiads and science fairs and what. Cool. I've got kids at Riverstone Village who are so excited that the next school's arts festival is coming up in March, and we're keeping the NPO open long enough that they can still enter it. And they're all going to get top marks because our kids are very creative. And it's quite funny watching the adjudicator assume that their art teacher is really, really good. And he's right. It just happens to be themselves, the internet, and their friends mostly. Um, Cohorting, we can replace age segregation with egalitarian mixing. And we go even further in democratic school environments. We don't distinguish between the adults and the kids in terms of status and needing to follow the rules and dignity and respect, right? The rights to freedom of movement and freedom of association can help to keep this going on. You can hang out with who you want, you can shift when you want to, and we can replace ageist domination with empowered agentic inclusion to support equity and diversity. With that freedom of movement and association, again, last night, Derry, in your talk, you were talking about the way you opened the doors between the classrooms so that the kids could move to the different teachers as needed for their interests and their projects. That was in a public school, right? And then, yes, progressively restore and refine something very important that C-Cube also destroyed. The infinite game of child-directed free play. Now, where did James Cars get the idea of infinite play? Go figure. He had the aha when he saw his kids playing make-believe games that different kids could join in and the parent could come and go and this game would keep going and the kids would have to negotiate in order that everybody would want to keep playing so they could keep it going for longer. That's where he got the idea that there is such a thing as infinite play to contrast with a finite game. And C-cubed, wow, ground zero, okay? And in terms of education, if we need this justification, children develop executive function, creativity, problem solving, collaboration, initiative, resilience, and more. You know, all of these things that we really want to see as educational outcomes. Free play is the thing. And that's also, you know, why it's a human right. The human rights people have pretty much got it in theory. We just need it now to be applied. So let's bring this back. So yeah, it's right for a good reason. Evolutionary psychologists like Peter, anthropologists like my mom and all of these show that in hunter-gatherer cultures, children are free to play all day, every day with age-mixed peers out of adult supervision. Children watched, listened, asked questions, used play to simulate adult roles, and slowly became aware of what they needed to do to survive and become contributing members of their family and society. That's from the founder of Sudbury Valley School, Daniel Greenberg. And that education plan helped our ancestors survive through all of our evolution. And that is what C-cubed replaced. So here's a roughly scaled visual representation of our educational history as a species. We've got hunter-gatherer societies with free play, mimicry, and mentoring for like that whole big green span. Then we've got agricultural societies, we've got free play, mimicry, and now they start adding apprenticeship, which is a bit more educationally directive. Then you've got schools, but now we're talking about maybe for a little bit of the nobility. We've got like ancient China, Rome, where they actually have subjects and some kind of a curriculum they're going to follow. And then you've got C-cubed in this little thin red line that you can maybe see over here that we now call traditional schooling. I mean, if there ever was a word not to use for C-cubed, I like to call it mainstream, and hopefully that won't apply for too much longer. We'll have to just call it C-cubed as it becomes extinct. It's my feeling on things. So just briefly, I promised you some snapshots from Riverstone. This was a surfboard simulator that was created. You actually climb on this thing and you have to balance and it moves in different directions. Quite genius. And this is like a whole habitat for something I can't remember, but there's a room downstairs and then you come up to this lovely roof garden with this complex banana tree. These girls are learning all sorts of social skills and problem solving because they're discussing what's wrong with the hideout they're trying to build here that's just not really working, and they're negotiating around what they're going to do next. This is an improv drama group. Again, learning how to work together and create because they're making up their own script as they go along. This lot are intrepid explorers going on an adventure into the wild because we had like 2 hectares of fields and lots of indigenous bush with nasty insects that suck your blood and things that can poke into your socks and even snakes that could kill you. But we did the risk assessments and the educational support. These kids are learning a lot of patience, negotiation, self-discipline. They're playing a game called Ninja, which requires you to freeze in position for long periods of time. These kids are learning about critical thinking and fake news and lies and truth. They're playing a very complex social game called Werewolf. Great favorite at Riverstone. This lot, my goodness me, they were actually creating tunnels, a series of intersecting tunnels under a mound, and the aim was to create as many tunnels under this mound from different directions as possible without collapsing it. I mean, wow, the collaboration and self-restraint and everything that took. And then, of course, the ultimate enculturation, if you want kids to learn that reading is just what we do, is not from an adult reading, it's from seeing the bigger kids read. Now, the critical thing to understand about all of these pictures is that they all had free access to uncapped Wi-Fi and devices at the time. I rest my case. This is another meeting where we were discussing how we were going to deal with coming back after lockdown in the pandemic. This was, again, a matter of collective discussion. And that's easy to do when you only have a small community. But how can bigger systems begin this shift? The bottom line is by putting human rights and other content intended to educate for peace into a prescribed, coerced curriculum, let alone assessing that, let alone rewarding those students who best engage with it, will absorb that effort into yet another finite game, making it just as likely to generate backlash as to effectively enculturate. So when I see people saying, yeah, we can, they're not using these words, but yeah, we can enculturate human rights by making sure the kids all study it and let's test them on it. Oh dear me. And the key is right at the heart of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. We have to stop using young people as pawns on the board in schooling and start respecting them as players, because the rules of an infinite game are changed to prevent anyone from winning the game and to bring as many possible people into the play. We need to bring the children into the play. So we have to start by giving them a real voice, which is where I say what we really need to lead us forward is enculturation with a Y, because the youth have a lot more to teach us at this point, honestly, really, truly, than we have to teach them. So this is where the Rights-Centric Education Network proposal comes in to progressively overhaul all educational spaces and interactions to align with the evolution of human rights. And the UNCRC can become a checklist that you can translate into practical steps to gradually transform. Which one are you going to work on first? Any educational space to nurture a culture of peace and to support true education. The 3 easiest concrete first steps to take in any order, and I suggest letting the children pick, and I know which one I think they'll pick. Anyone, anywhere, take well-being seriously for everyone. Make sure everyone has a real voice. Make real space and time for real play. And you can find out more by joining here. And what next? I'd like to point out that there's many other amazing sessions on this conference. We can definitely post these links along to you with this recording, but go and have a look. Coming up in 30 minutes time is this session from David and Lush of Evolving Education, highly recommended, although you're also welcome to stay in this session and discuss if your brain is not completely numbed by my monologue. On the 24th, Sifan will be looking at upholding children's rights in schools. So I suggest you prioritize that. Then we've got on Monday, scaling democratic education from margins to mainstream. I'll be helping out with that one as well. Hope to see you there. Richard is going to be looking at transforming traditional secondary schools on the 27th, the next day. And then there are numerous youth-led events as well that I think, we want to try and support that thing of, when kids do have a voice and take a voice, we want to show up so that they're not talking to an empty room. And Richard has coordinated some links there that you can get to that we'll send out to you as well. So that finally brings me to the end of my dump. Apologies for the length and intensity. I did remove a number of slides so that I wouldn't take you 10 minutes over time, never mind to the end. And yeah, we can do some discussion now. I totally understand if you want to leave on the dot, but I'm going to hang around for a little bit. And I think Richard would like to say something. So over to you, Richard. I'm thrilled to see you still here. You survived. Well done.
Survived well and inspired. Wonderful presentation. I wanted to follow up with some of what you've encouraged, Jana, that we all do what we can to reduce C cubed or C cubed in schools. I think you would be aware of the call by the UN rapporteur for feedback into a report that she's putting together. And so I put a link to those requirements. I assume that you're probably sending in some feedback on that, which is great. Uh, I'll be doing something as well. Uh, I want to do a shout out to people that are on this call. There's Henning and Safan who were responsible for getting the IDEC 2023 resolution adopted. And that work I see as the beginning of what IDEC, sorry. No, it's UDEC members have currently been able to do, and they've made personal contact with the UN rapporteur that's doing this report, and she's invited reports from people like us. So anybody who has something that's more or less ready to go, they can just trim it down like Derry's talk yesterday or yours here. They want max about 3,000 words if you can get requests or input into them that will bring their attention to things like you and Derry have been saying. Don, who's on this call, and his partner Joyce are going to be presenting this session tomorrow. And then Jana mentioned my presentation, which is a concrete way that we can begin to reduce the C cube effect in secondary schools. So some concrete ideas for making that happen, like Derry presented yesterday with his 20% concept, a good way to start reducing the C cubed effect in schools. So some action items there for those that would like to follow up on some of them. I'm sure everybody here could offer some other thoughts on that. So thank you. I may disappear in about 3 minutes to join Luz and David.
Great. I see also here Lisa Loop. You've got a thing you're suggesting we check out. Kepler, something which also aims to reduce C cubes. Please do send anything that you think is relevant so that we can share it with everybody with the recording. You can just email myself or drop it in the chat right now before you leave as well. And then there's also a YouTube playlist that's got a link, and you can send to Richard or myself. any video, preferably short. We're trying to keep them shortish on that list so people can kind of really get through. And Richard created a number of shorts, and I think he's going to be also creating some more. But if you can also send short things that you think belong there. Yeah, and apologies to those whose sessions I didn't mention. I had that much space on the slide and that much space in the time. So with that, that brings us to the official end of the session. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And now anybody who would like to share your own perspectives or ask clarifying questions or anything that you'd like to do, the floor is now further open.
If nobody else wants to share, I'll jump in.
Yes, no, go for it. That would be great.
Hi to all of you from Northern California. I'm working with, we have a project called the Open Portal Network, which I suspect is very much like the right-centric education network. It's supposed to be a network of networks. So we don't want to be the center. We just want to be one node in a growing network so that we can, so that each of these groups that are interested in improving education and making it about well-being can discover each other. This is going on all over the world, and we need a meshwork so that I think of it as the subway station or the transportation station, not the destination. So Open Portal Network is supposed to open doors and build bridges between people that want to expand education. It's not necessarily destroy traditional education because it does work for some people, but expand it so we have education that works for everybody. Go ahead, anybody else?
Great. So what I love also there is that, again, you're describing more and more of us are kind of moving into this more infinite play mode where it's not necessarily about an organization that's going to like, this is our organization, but we're going into that network mode, which is more infinite. I just do want to comment about it does work for some people. I don't believe that C cubed works for anybody except the people who benefit from the extraction. But again, as I said, you can do a curriculum, you can do deadlines, you can do tests and exams. Point is, you need to be doing them in infinite mode. You need to be doing them from empowered space where you're not being coerced, because it's when that coercion, that coerced competition is what really does the harm. So yeah, there's quite a nice film. Sorry, but there's quite a nice film. I've just gone blank on it. That one in German about the end of where they envision that compulsory gets taken away, and then the schools are still there running classes, but you can go and sign up for it, and a lot of people don't use it because the whole society becomes a learning society, and kids are learning in furniture shops and conversation everywhere. Yeah.
There are groups in Spain, there are groups in the US, there's lots and lots and lots of activity, and we don't know each other very well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the previous session, one of the little clips that Richard extracted, I said it's actually beautiful that every single time that we do something like this, we make another connection with somebody like you who's making connections. It's like we felt isolated, we felt small, and it's just not real. Now is when we start discovering each other and realizing that we are the mycelium and that we actually span the whole globe. And these little tiny isolated mushrooms popping up, we've actually all got the same driving love driving us. Yeah. Derry, love to hear from you.
I just wanted to say fantastic to be introduced to some new ideas. These gaming ideas absolutely make sense, and thank you so much, Gianna. Thank you so much too for referencing my talk from yesterday. I put my email address in the chat. If anyone wants a copy, I'll happily send it to them. And now an apology for leaving because I really promised to go to Lewis and David's
Yes.
Unfortunately, they overlap by half an hour. So
yeah, right.
thanks again.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Please go well, and please give them my love. I'm going to go and cook dinner for my family. And yeah, go well. And if you're going to do one thing as an individual, please get hold of Derry's talk from yesterday and distribute that to anyone that you think is what Derry calls a responsible subversive, you know, which is somebody that's in the system who can recognize what needs to happen and is ready to flow with young people when the young people come with an empowering idea. Yeah, great. All right, unless somebody else has a driving question or contribution, then I suggest we close the session so that you can also experience the wonderful David and Luth. Is anybody burning? Max?
We just want to enthusiastically clap for us.
Oh, and it's beautiful to see you guys. Look at you.
In the
Such a
crazy
lovely
town of trying to do this in a community setting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
The C cube is also present in every environment.
Yes.
So it's quite a challenge, but
yes.
It's developing. So
yeah.
Big thanks from us.
Yeah. Well, the C cubed has become our normal. You know, it's
Yes.
what we've all been enculturated into. So now we have to acculturate ourselves. Got some beautiful face paint going on there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Beautiful to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Any final anything before we close up? All right. Well, then I think with lots of love to everybody. And yeah, let's keep networking and sharing everything and everyone. So have a wonderful Learning Planet Festival, and I'm sure